Right now, something is happening in the United States that feels bigger than ordinary politics because it isn't just about headlines anymore. It's about the system itself reacting to pressure in real time. Over the past 24 hours, a wave of claims has hit the internet that a federal judge has taken an extraordinary step, that impeachment is being fast-tracked, and that Washington is bracing for instability. At the same time, security posture and public tension are rising because the moment you mix court action, impeachment talk, and a civil war warning from a former president, people don't treat it like normal speech. They treat it like a threat environment. And here's the key detail most people miss. In America, you don't need chaos in the streets for a crisis to begin. A crisis begins when institutions stop assuming tomorrow will be calm and start planning as if it won't be. Tonight, we're going to separate noise from signals, what is actually on the record, what is being claimed, what is procedurally possible, and why the nation's capital reacts differently when legal pressure meets political escalation. Because when Washington starts moving like it expects trouble, it usually knows something the public hasn't fully processed yet. Here's what makes this moment dangerous. Not one single headline. It's the combination of three forces hitting at once: legal pressure, impeachment pressure, and street-level risk. First, the legal side. Online commentary is pushing an extreme narrative that a federal judge has effectively launched impeachment by sending evidence directly to Congress while a trial is still active. That is a massive claim, so massive that if it were fully confirmed, it would dominate every major outlet and official docket coverage. The reality is you should treat that claim like an unverified alarm until you can point to clear primary documentation and consistent reporting. Because in modern politics, the fastest moving stories online are often built to feel inevitable before they are proven true. Second, the impeachment side. Here is what is real and measurable. Impeachment doesn't start with rage. It starts with paperwork, sponsors, and a vote count. There have been formal impeachment efforts filed in Congress in this era, including resolutions drafted with multiple articles. Those documents exist, and they show something important. The idea of impeachment isn't just rhetoric. It's a tool that lawmakers keep on the table, even when it has long odds. And when legal events or new evidence appear, that tool can suddenly move from symbolic to operational. Third, the security side. This is where things turn from political theater into national risk. Washington doesn't deploy posture changes for drama. It tightens when officials believe the threat picture is shifting: crowd risk, extremist chatter, intimidation concerns, or the fear that a flashpoint event could trigger real-world confrontation. Now connect that to the Civil War warning. Words like that do not function like ordinary speech, especially from a political figure with a mass following. In law enforcement and intelligence terms, that language is treated as a potential trigger. It can radicalize, mobilize, and compress decision-making into hours. And once the threat picture changes, the government doesn't wait for trouble to arrive. It tries to deter it. So the real story isn't a single claim. The real story is the institutional mood shift, the sense that Washington is preparing for instability, not because it wants escalation, but because it believes escalation is plausible. And when the system starts planning around worst-case behavior, it usually means one thing: somebody in power thinks the next move could be reckless. To understand why Washington's response feels unusually tense, you have to understand how institutions behave when they believe norms may no longer hold. In normal political crises, officials assume two things: time exists and restraint will eventually return. That assumption is what allows delays, negotiations, and quiet damage control. But that assumption collapses when language and behavior suggest instability could accelerate instead of slow down. That is exactly what has changed. When a former president publicly frames accountability as an existential threat, using words like civil war, the system no longer interprets events through a political lens. It switches to a risk lens. And risk assessment does not ask whether a statement is rhetorical. It asks whether it could motivate action. This is why Washington's posture matters more than online commentary. Security perimeters don't expand because of opinions. They expand because Planners believe a convergence is possible, legal pressure on one side, mobilized supporters on the other, and a narrative of illegitimacy in between. That combination has a history in the United States, and officials are acutely aware of it. You can see the shift in how lawmakers are behaving. Closed-door briefings increase, movement protocols change. Staff are advised to work remotely, not because something has happened, but because institutions are preparing for what could happen if escalation continues. And escalation has not been subtle. Since legal and impeachment pressure intensified, the messaging has grown louder, faster, and more confrontational. Posts are not measured, attacks are personal, judges are named, institutions are accused. That matters because once judges and courts become targets in public rhetoric, the situation crosses a line that lawmakers and law enforcement cannot ignore. This is also where impeachment stops being a theoretical debate and starts becoming a containment tool. Impeachment is not only about removal, it is also about stabilizing authority. When Congress moves decisively, it sends a signal to supporters, opponents, and foreign governments that constitutional control still exists. That signal becomes more important as rhetoric grows more extreme. This is why some lawmakers who were previously cautious begin to reconsider their position when tension rises, not because they suddenly change ideology, but because delay itself becomes a liability. In moments like this, inaction can look like permission. And Washington is highly sensitive to one thing above all else, the appearance that no one is in control. Once officials believe that perception is forming, the response hardens. The language becomes procedural. The planning becomes visible. The system stops waiting for reassurance and starts building barriers instead. This is the stage where political disputes become institutional tests, not because anyone wants confrontation, but because institutions are designed to survive it. At a certain point, political pressure stops being abstract and starts behaving like a timer. That is where the situation now stands. For decades, presidents under investigation relied on a familiar strategy: delay, appeal rulings, challenge jurisdiction, run out the calendar, let elections, public fatigue, or shifting headlines intervene. That strategy works only as long as institutions agree to move slowly. What changes everything is when delay itself is perceived as a risk. Once courts, lawmakers, and security agencies believe that time favors instability rather than calm, timelines compress. Decisions that normally take months are reconsidered in days. Conversations that stay private move into formal channels. Contingency planning becomes active instead of theoretical. This is why Washington feels like it has shifted gears. Legal pressure plays a critical role here. When courts believe their authority is being openly challenged, whether through defiance, intimidation, or public attacks, the judiciary is forced to protect itself, not emotionally, procedurally. Courts respond by tightening control, clarifying records, and documenting behavior in ways that limit ambiguity. That documentation matters because ambiguity is oxygen for delay. At the same time, Congress watches closely. Lawmakers are not legal spectators. They are risk managers. They understand that once evidence becomes formalized, sworn testimony, filings, transcripts, authenticated records, the political cost of ignoring it rises sharply. Silence becomes a position, neutrality disappears. This is where impeachment dynamics quietly change. Impeachment does not ignite because of outrage. It accelerates when the cost of waiting exceeds the cost of acting. And that calculation shifts dramatically when public behavior appears to worsen under pressure rather than stabilize. The more aggressive the rhetoric becomes, the more it reinforces the argument that traditional guardrails are failing. And once that perception spreads inside Congress, hesitation looks irresponsible rather than cautious. This is also the stage where party discipline weakens. Political parties are built on loyalty, but they survive on survivability. When members begin asking themselves whether defending the president exposes them personally to voters, to investigations, or to future accountability, that loyalty starts to fracture, not loudly, quietly, in meetings, in calls, in changes of tone. Defection does not begin with speeches, it begins with silence. Washington has seen this pattern before. The moment when allies stop defending publicly, stop amplifying talking points, and start speaking only in procedural language. That shift signals something critical. They are preparing for outcomes they no longer control. And that is why this moment feels different, because once legal pressure, institutional fear, and political self-preservation align, the system stops reacting emotionally and starts moving mechanically, step by step, rule by rule, without drama, but with momentum. This is the phase where outcomes stop depending on persuasion and start depending on math, procedure, and time. This is the stage most people misunderstand. They assume political collapses happen because opinions change. They don't. They happen because risk calculations do. Inside Congress, loyalty lasts only as long as defense feels survivable. The moment defending a president becomes more dangerous than distancing from him, behavior changes fast, not emotionally, strategically. And that shift is now visible. Lawmakers who once spoke confidently begin choosing their words carefully. Statements shrink, interviews disappear, social media goes quiet. This is not confusion, it is assessment. Members are asking themselves very specific questions. Can I defend this on camera? Can I explain this under oath? Can I justify silence if new evidence emerges tomorrow? When the answer becomes uncertain, loyalty weakens. This is where rhetoric from the president himself becomes a liability. Attacking judges does not rally institutions, it alarms them. Threatening unrest does not intimidate Congress. It accelerates contingency planning. Every escalation tightens the argument that restraint is no longer working. From a legal perspective, this matters even more. When a political figure under pressure continues to issue aggressive, unfiltered statements, those statements stop being reaction. They become part of the record, time-stamped, archived, preserved. Once behavior begins to reinforce allegations rather than contradict them, it strengthens the case for intervention. This is why some allies begin backing away without announcing it. They understand that when evidence accumulates, association becomes exposure. Being the last defender standing does not earn loyalty points. It attracts scrutiny. And in moments like this, scrutiny is the one thing lawmakers try hardest to avoid. Behind closed doors, conversations turn blunt, not ideological, practical. What happens if this escalates further? What happens if courts move faster? What happens if violence becomes plausible? What happens if history asks who stood where? That is the moment fear replaces loyalty. And fear does not produce chaos inside institutions. It produces order. Rules are invoked, procedures are activated, timelines are enforced. This is how systems protect themselves when personalities become unpredictable. The public often expects shouting and spectacle. What actually happens is colder, quieter, more decisive. This is also why security measures increase even when streets look calm. Authorities are not reacting to crowds. They are reacting to trajectories. They understand that when narratives harden, mobilization can happen suddenly and asymmetrically. Washington remembers that lesson well. So when you see barriers rising, guard units standing by, and officials speaking in clipped technical language, that is not panic, that is containment. The system is signaling that it is no longer negotiating with uncertainty. It is preparing for outcomes. And once that shift happens, the process rarely reverses itself. This is the point where everything narrows. Once institutions shift from waiting to acting, outcomes stop depending on personalities and start depending on procedure. That is the moment Washington has reached. At this stage, Donald Trump is no longer facing a single pressure point. He is facing multiple tracks moving at the same time: congressional action, judicial scrutiny, security containment. None of these lanes require his approval, and none of them pause for rhetoric. That is what makes this moment fundamentally different from past crises. Impeachment, once activated, follows rules that do not bend to public anger or public support. Votes are counted. Thresholds are fixed. Once the House acts, the next steps are automatic. The system does not ask whether the moment is politically convenient. It proceeds because the Constitution demands it. Parallel to that, legal exposure continues independently. Courts do not wait for elections. Judges do not negotiate with public threats. Records accumulate whether a defendant cooperates or not. And once behavior under pressure appears to worsen instead of stabilize, it strengthens the justification for faster intervention. This is why Washington no longer looks uncertain. It looks resolved. Security posture remains elevated not because violence has already occurred, but because officials understand that rhetoric can turn into action quickly when authority is challenged publicly. The goal is deterrence, visibility, control, not escalation, but prevention. Inside Congress, the calculation has already shifted. This is no longer about ideology or party loyalty. It is about risk management. Lawmakers are positioning themselves not for today's headlines, but for tomorrow's accountability. History does not ask who spoke loudest. It asks who acted when the system was under strain. That is why silence is breaking. That is why statements are changing tone. That is why the process feels mechanical, not emotional. Power, in moments like this, stops being personal. It becomes institutional, and institutions are designed to survive individuals. Whether removal ultimately succeeds or fails in one chamber is no longer the only question that matters. Authority has already fractured. Trust has already eroded. Control, once lost, does not fully return. Even without conviction, governance becomes constrained, contested, and unstable. This is the reality Washington is preparing for. The countdown is not symbolic. It is procedural. Every hour adds records. Every escalation tightens scrutiny. Every attempt to intimidate reinforces the case for restraint imposed from outside the presidency itself. What remains now is not speculation. It is process, and process moves forward whether anyone likes it or not.